Last time we discussed the introduction to environmental science. In that lecture, we talked about how environmental science is inherently interdisciplinary, but it's also extremely data driven. And this data helps us shape solutions to environmental problems. We also, in a second lecture, talked about the scientific method, how it is the basis for the entire scientific process. We discussed types of experiments and types of research, the importance of reproducibility within those experiments, and then also the origins of environmental thinking. Today, we're going to cover the first part of evolution, species interactions, and biological communities. The first thing we need to touch on is natural selection and adaptation and how those act to modify species. So you might ask yourself, how does a polar bear endure the long, sunless, super cold Arctic winter? Or how the cactus is able to survive blistering temperatures under that really oppressive sunlight in the drought of the desert? Each species like these have inherited characteristics or traits that help them survive. So of course, the polar bear has heat capturing fur, insulating fat layers, and wide feet for swimming. Also, it has white hair that makes it nearly invisible to the seals that it needs to catch for food. Of course, we know the cactus has specially adapted leaves or spines and water retaining cells that help save water and capture that water for times in which it won't experience water again. So all of these represent adaptations, the acquisition of traits that allow a species to survive in its environment. This is the most important concept in biology. Adaptation involves changes in a population with characteristics that are passed from one generation to the next. And these changes are all to increase the fitness of an organism. Fitness, simply defined, is the ability to survive and reproduce. It doesn't have anything to do with how physically strong that organism is. It is simply the ability to survive its environment and reproduce. So natural selection acts on traits in DNA. We know that these traits are encoded in genes, which are portions of an individual organism's DNA. Every organism, including you and me, we have thousands and thousands of genes. Occasionally, random mutations happen when that DNA is replicated. If those random changes occur in reproductive cells, then they can be passed on to offspring. Those random changes are called mutations. Most mutations do not have any real effect on an organism. Some are deleterious, some are bad for the organism. If an organism has bad mutations, it's not going to have good fitness. It is not going to survive and reproduce. On the opposite side, though, if you have a mutation that causes a benefit, that might increase the fitness of that organism, allowing it to survive and reproduce. So different organisms survive differently based on the adaptations that they have acquired through changes in allelic frequency. What do I mean by allelic frequency? An allele is simply a gene variant. And within a population, you'll have different amounts of different gene variants. So the frequency of those gene variants is the allelic frequency. The frequency of gene variants is the allelic frequency. So we already talked about how these changes to the DNA of individuals are called mutations. These mutations, in effect, change the allelic frequency within a population. And mutations that provide competitive advantages can increase an individual's fitness. So natural selection and evolution work hand in hand. Natural selection is the mechanism for biological evolution. The process of the fittest individuals passing their traits to the next generation is called natural selection. those individuals who have mutations or alleles, gene variants that are not going to increase their fitness, they're not going to reproduce as many of them. Therefore, that gene variant is going to be lowered in the population. So natural selection is the mechanism behind biological evolution, and evolution is the non-random selection of those random mutations. This is the cornerstone of biology, and it has been said by Theodoros Dobzhansky that nothing in biology makes sense except in light of evolution. This is made clear when we're talking about competition between species or competition between two different species. It all has to do with evolution. Darwin was one of the many who first observed and really thought about the origins of natural variation in populations. He, of course, posed one of the greatest scientific questions of all time. He wrote an entire book about it called On the Origin of Species. And he first sparked this thought on his voyage on the HMS Beagle when he observed on islands in the Galapagos different types of finches. And we'll talk about a little bit more detail what this means, but Darwin's finches really helped to serve the framework for those scientific questions that he posed. So in any environment, there is a range of tolerance for those variations. So if we are going to trace along this environmental gradient here, we have most organisms falling within this optimum range. This could be any type of physical property or trait or behavioral property or trait. Most species, however, within a population are going to exhibit this optimum. Once we start getting across the left and the right portions of this graph, we don't have many representatives present. It might be a zone of physiological stress to the left and the right. And then finally, we get to a zone of intolerance where the changes are so great that the organism is no longer particularly adapted for that environment. So we don't have any species representing that extreme of that gene variant. This was first posed by an ecologist named Victor Shelford. We need to talk about niches, okay? Niches are a counterpart to habitat, but very different. So habitat is describing the place or set of environmental conditions in which a particular organism lives. A niche, on the other hand, describes both the role played by a species in a community, as well as a set of environmental factors that determine its distribution. So here we have a Venn diagram that describes what each of these are on their own, but also their shared characteristics in between. So habitat, again, is the physical place. It's the environment in which that organism is. And the habitat must provide the organism with essential things that it needs to survive and reproduce, like food, warmth, shelter, oxygen, minerals. Niche, on the other hand, is how the organism fits into the entire ecosystem in which they find themselves. It's how a species uses and affects its environment. There's always a back and forth. The organism must take from its environment, but it also gives to its environment as well. The niche also encompasses the organism's response to limited resources in their environment, as well as their response to competitors. When we're talking about aspects of biodiversity or ecological threats, that is where we have the intersection of habitat and niche. So let's talk about different niches that an organism can serve. In animal populations, for example, we have what we call generalists. These are species that can tolerate a wide range of conditions or exploit a wide range of resources. These generalists usually have pretty large geographic ranges, And they include things like the North American black bear. These genera are typically omnivores, meaning they can eat both meat and plant-based resources. They tolerate many habitats, so their geographic range is pretty wide. And they are highly adaptive, meaning they have strategies to interact with successfully different types of environments. The flip side of that are specialists, like the Asian giant panda. These specialists, unlike their generalist counterparts, have narrow niches that they must occupy. They have a very narrow, constrictive diet. For example, the Asian giant panda eats bamboo. Okay, that is its resource for food. It can't pick up anything that it sees and eats it. It must use the bamboo as its food source. Likewise, they have a limited habitat tolerance. So typically the specialists in nature do not have a wide geographic range. They're found in pretty isolated areas, and they are not adaptive. This brings in the competitive exclusion principle. The competitive exclusion principle states that no two species can occupy the same ecological niche for too long. One is going to eventually outcompete the other because that one is more efficient in using the available resources in the environment. Therefore, it excludes the other species that is not quite adapted to use those available resources. That other species, through competitive exclusion, can either go extinct, it can disappear, or it can evolve and develop its own new niche. It can be creative in exploiting new resources. This is a process that we call resource partitioning. And this whole idea was first posed by a Russian biologist named Gauss, and we'll learn about this in a video that I've posted for you. But this resource partitioning can allow several species to utilize different parts of the same resource and coexist within the same habitat. So again, this is the dichotomous idea of habitat and niche. While they're within the same physical space, the same habitat, they each have different roles to play. They are each utilizing different resources, thereby not in direct competition with each other. There is a video, as I mentioned previously, that I posted to the tartan for you to watch about the importance of the competitive exclusion principle in ecology and environmental science. So competition leads to resource allocation. Organisms compete for resources that are in limited supply. This could be anything like energy in the form of food or minerals or water or living space or shelter. All of these things are needed to carry out life's activities. Competition is a type of antagonistic relationship in a biological communities. So for example, plants, they have to compete for growing space, and therefore they need to develop roots and leaves so they can absorb and process sunlight and water. So they are in competition for living space. That's because, believe it or not, sunlight and water for those plants is in limited supply. Competition among members of the same species is called intraspecific competition. Competition between members of different species is called interspecific competition. I remember this by remembering that interstates take me between different states. So interspecific is competition between different species, and intraspecific is competition among members of the same species. An example of this resource partitioning and allocation is species of warblers. They are able to partition their resources within the same habitat to reduce that competition. Of course, there are three possible outcomes within this system. One species could leave or they could die. both species could leave or die, or they could do this resource partitioning that we do observe in warblers. So several species of insect-eating wood warblers occupy the same forests in eastern North America. The competitive exclusion principle predicts that they should partition their shared resource, which is insect food. And this is all in order to reduce competition. And in fact, this is what we observe. So different species of warblers feast upon different types of insects that inhabit different locations of an individual tree. So this is just a very clear and easy example to remember how ecosystems can harbor different species that might be in the same habitat, so one tree, but resource allocation and resource partitioning allows them to coexist with each other. So this begs the question, where do we get species diversity? Where do we get all of this biodiversity? Where do we get those new species of warblers? This is all through a process called speciation and adaptive radiation. So as a population becomes more and more adapted to its ecological niche, it may develop specialized or distinctive traits that eventually differentiate it from biological cousins. And the rising of new species is called speciation. This typically occurs through geographic isolation. We call speciation through geographic isolation allopatric speciation. Allo, A-L-L-O, means separate. Patric means homeland. Okay, so taking our example of Darwin's finches, Darwin noticed that at each Galapagos island that he visited, there were finch species, but all of these finch species, depending upon which island he visited, had various shapes of beaks. What he found is that the beak shape directly correlated to the type of prey item that it used to feed itself. So for example, this beak shape is good for breaking open seeds. You go to a different island and you see that this beak shape is really good at eating fruit and taking buds off of plants. We have another beak shape that's good at picking up grubs, so very narrow and pointy to basically like tweezers pick up grubs of insects. Okay, so this is a schematic cartoon way to think about allopatric speciation. We have an original population, so this one that ate seeds. A small population of that one species goes to a neighboring island and it colonizes that island. And through enough time, and if we don't have immigration and emigration back and forth, that population that colonized that little island eventually becomes its own species. We can also see this speciation event in wrasses, which is a type of fish. The original population split up when the Isthmus of Panama was formed. So before we had this landmass that we call the Isthmus of Panama, there was free flow for the wrasse populations to swim on this side and on this side. However, once that Panama was erected through geological processes, we had a physical separation. This physical separation allowed the wrasse species to evolve independently of each other. Again, there's no crosstalk between the two populations, and therefore they're now two distinct separate species, one on each side of Central America. The barriers that divide subpopulations, they're not always physical. For example, take the two virtually identical tree frogs here. We have Hyla versicolor and Hyla crassus. They live in similar habitats in Eastern North America, but they have different mating calls. Okay, so they were able to speciate in a different way. We call this type of speciation, where it's triggered by a behavioral mechanism, sympatric speciation. So their behavior of using different mating calls resulted in speciation within the same geographic area, and therefore they became two different species through sympatric speciation. And we should listen now to the, who I like to call the OG environmental scientist, Sir David Attenborough. He is a fantastic science communicator, and he is the best at explaining this stuff.
The ancestors of these iguanas almost certainly lived in the jungles of Central America. There, still today, you can see iguanas in the trees overhanging the rivers, nibbling leaves, or on rafts of reeds. Just occasionally are swept out to sea, and the vast majority, of course, die there. But just a few, a long time ago, were fortunate enough to be swept by favorable currents out to the ocean and pitched up here. In their ancestral rainforest habitat, iguanas are vegetarians. Here, they browse on juicy leaves. But the iguanas that first appeared in the Galapagos could find no such things. So these iguanas, to survive, had to eat the only kind of leaf that was available: seaweed. And to get the best of that, they had to do something even more radical. They had to swim. They even learned to dive. They acquired the ability to hold their breath for up to an hour so that they could swim down to a depth of 20 meters. Their claws strengthened so they could cling to the rocks on the seabed. And under the water, they found an endless supply of seaweed, which grew in abundance in the nutrient-rich currents that flow around the islands. That was not all. Their snouts became flatter to help them graze. And their teeth became sharper to grip the slippery seaweed.
All right. Sorry for the sound cutting out. That was a little annoying, but as Sir David Attenborough clearly pointed out, there are specific adaptations that these iguanas living in the Galapagos Islands have that are distinct from their ancestral species that they came from, the biological cousins, if you will. So selection pressure can make certain mutations advantageous. This is clearly seen in giraffes, for example, in the shift toward one extreme of a trait. It is much better for a giraffe to have a long neck to nibble on high limbs and leaves. This is an example of directional selection, where there was one direction that evolution was clearly pointing towards, and that was the evolution of a longer neck. Sometimes environmental conditions can reduce variation in a trait. This is what we call stabilizing selection. This is when the extremes are selected against, those living at the extreme of a gene variant one way or the other, those are not adequately suited for the environment in which they live. Therefore, they do not have good fitness, they do not reproduce, and we then select for those in the middle. Other times, environmental conditions can cause traits to diverge to the extremes. This is what we call disruptive selection in the example of finches. And so if we were to plot this to get a visual example, this is what we would see. So for example, if we have different finches with different beak shapes in the original population, with the number of individuals on the y-axis here, and the variation in the trait on the x-axis, if that population was to undergo directional selection, pushing into the extreme of the trait to the right, we would then have most of the organisms, the individuals in that population, exhibiting the trait for this beak shape. If, however, the original population was undergoing stabilizing selection, the extremes would be selected against, and we would largely have a population that looks like this. Most of the individuals would have this beak shape. And finally, in the third example with disruptive selection, the extremes are selected for. So most of the individuals in the population would either have this beak shape or this beak shape. Regardless of what things look like, we have to call things by scientific names. And taxonomists are the biologists who use various lines of evidence, like genetic similarities or physical traits, to determine their names. So taxonomy is the study of types of organisms and their relationships. And taxonomists are able to use these relationships to classify all life into three general domains according to cell structure. So for example, the prokaryotes, those that do not have a true nucleus, those are bacteria and archaea. We mostly find bacteria in everywhere, in and on you, out in nature, on leaves, inside ants, for example, in ponds, lakes, streams, everywhere, and everywhere you can imagine, you can find bacteria. We also have this other domain called archaea. Now, when archaea were first discovered, they were considered to only be extremophiles or extreme loving microorganisms. The first archaea that were found in hot springs, extremely high temperatures, very, very low pHs, extreme conditions to a human framework. But now we're beginning to find archaea all over the place. A archaean that you might be most familiar with are the methanogens that make methane inside cow guts. And we also have the third domain called eukarya. These are called eukarya because they have a true nucleus. The word eu, EU, means true, and karya means kernel. Okay, kernel being that nucleus. So bacteria and archaea are prokaryotes. They, before the nucleus, so these were on Earth, they evolved on Earth before the advent of the nucleus, and then eukarya have that true nucleus. Most organisms with which we are familiar, they're in the eukarya, but we will, in the next slide, get to open our mind a little bit about the diversity of life on Earth. But the four kingdoms of eukarya, we have the animals, plants, fungi, and protists. And I should note, just because I'm a stickler, protists are really no longer formally recognized by taxonomists because they are not from one direct descendant. So if you know me, I'm a microbial ecologist and I have a very microbial sense for the world, and most of life actually is microbial. And so I'm going to let my friend, Dr. Luke McKay, who's an astrobiologist at Montana State University, explain why we know that is.
This image represents the most up-to-date understanding of the overall diversity of life on our planet. This is our tree of life. When two branches on this tree are very close together, that means the DNA of those two organisms is not actually that different. So as indicated by Beyonce, here we are. But how does everyone else live? Elephants, praying mantises, sea anemones, for example, they each live the same way that we do. They get their electrons from food and they move their electrons to oxygen. And this is where they're located on the tree of life. Tulips, carrots, and palm trees, they do things a little differently. They get electrons from water, and with the help of the sun, they move those to carbon dioxide. And this is their position on the tree of life. Even an oyster mushroom only gets us to here. Animals, plants, and fungi seem so diverse, but according to their DNA, they only represent this tiny fraction of life on Earth. Now, when we add some examples from the microscopic world of life, that's when things start to get interesting. Let's just name a few together. Are you ready? Anomoxyglobus propionicus, Thiomargarita namibiensis, and my personal favorite, Methanothermobacter thermotrophicus. Despite their annoyingly long names, these are the organisms that perform all sorts of really cool electron transfers. These particular microbes get their electrons from ammonium, sulfide, and hydrogen, and they move those electrons to nitrite, oxygen, and carbon dioxide. And that's just 3 examples. This image
So in order to classify, taxonomists divide living things into these 3 domains. And what's important to note about this tree of life is that they all share a common ancestor. This probably roamed the earth about 4 billion years ago. And from this single distinct last universal common ancestor arose all the vast diversity that we see on our planet today. And all of this vast diversity has a name. The way we name things is through binomial nomenclature. And this is a system that is used by every type of biologist. They could be an ecologist, a microbiologist, a botanist. All scientists who classify and name things use binomial nomenclature. It is called binomial nomenclature because it is a 2-part name. This 2-part name is also referred to as the scientific name, the Latin name, or the Linnaean classification. So within these 4 kingdoms, we have millions and millions of different species. And because we have so many species, it is very important that we have a single scientific name for individual species. That way, when we're publishing our results about something or having a communication at a meeting about a particular species, we're all on the same page. The 2-part binomial names contains the genus and a specific epithet. Okay, so these 2 things put together is the species name. For example, the thing that we refer to as a mountain lion, Puma concolor, is also called a cougar, the American panther, the painter, and the puma. Okay, so for this one thing, we have multiple different colloquial or common names. So it is important through scientific communications that we stick to one scientific name. This naming system is all founded on the taxonomic hierarchy, and it all starts with those domains that we were talking about. So if we are wanting to classify with the taxonomic hierarchy, what we would call the red fox, we would first have to start at the very, very top. So the domain for the fox is Eukarya. It is a eukaryote. It is within the animal kingdom. It is within the phylum Chordata. It is within the class Mammalia. The order is Carnivora. The family is Canidae. The genus is Vulpes, and the species is Vulpes vulpes. Okay, so together, the genus and the specific epithet make up its name. Now, this is a kind of confusing example because the genus name and the specific epithet is the same, but you can also think about Homo sapiens. Homo is the genus that humans fall into, and sapiens is a specific epithet that gets attached to the genus name. But regardless of what you are called, you need food to live. So now we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the different roles that living organisms play in their environment, particularly with regards to food. So of course, all organisms need food to live. We know that producers like photosynthesizers make their own food, but consumers, on the other hand, have to consume organic matter that they themselves cannot produce. So in terms of consumers, we have a couple of different types. We have herbivores, those that eat plant material. We have carnivores, those that eat meat. And then we have omnivores, those that can eat both plant material and animal material. So all of these, believe it or not, are considered to be predators because they feed on live prey. Now, granivores, organisms that eat grains, they do not have to eat live prey, therefore they're not predators, but herbivores eating grasses and shrubs and trees are considered to be predators. So often we only think of carnivores as predators, but actually this is not the case. We also have under the umbrella of consumer other things. We have scavengers, detritivores, decomposers. All of these are feeding on dead things. And in this way, they are not predators. And the detritivore is an organism that eats detritus. So material that has fallen to the ground, it's now decaying. The detritivores eat that decaying material. Decomposers are really good at helping to decompose that material that is on the wood floor, for example. So a great example of a decomposer are our fungi, the fungus that release enzymes into the surrounding environment under the soil that decomposes the organic material and then brings it in through its mycelia or specialized root-like structures. Scavengers, these are things like birds that eat dead material. Carrion is the official term for dead things. So scavengers eat things that are already dead, therefore they are not considered a predator. So predation is actually a very important agent of natural selection. And in this way, I'm using the term agent to mean it's something that causes natural selection to move forward. So these predator-prey relationships exert selection pressures that favor evolutionary adaptation. Prey organisms have developed countless strategies to avoid being eaten, to avoid predation. This includes toxic or bad tasting compounds or body armor. We can see this in a horned beetle, for example, with this really hard chitinous exoskeleton, or spines, thorns, things that pick and poke, says, hey, don't eat me, you're gonna get a mouthful of nasty spines. Or even the thick lignin of tree bark. That is an adaptation to prevent predation upon the woody interior. So because prey items get good at adapting and evolving these defenses, so in turn, predators become more efficient at searching and feeding. And so we have this co-evolution between predator and prey and this co-evolutionary arms race in order to, as a predator, be able to efficiently prey upon your meals and as prey, efficiently evade being eaten. This is called the dinner life principle that simply states that rabbits run faster than foxes for the simple reason that they are running for their lives while the fox is only concerned with its supper. There's another way to adapt to not being eaten as a prey item, and this is through special coloration. You might be familiar with poison arrow frogs. They display striking patterns and brilliant colors. And this in itself is a specific adaptation that alerts potential predators to the extremely toxic secretions that they have on their skin. Indigenous people in Latin America actually use this toxin to arm the tip of their darts that they use in blowguns. So this is an example of a species with chemical defense that displays distinct coloration to warn its enemies away. We call this specific type of coloration aposematic coloration. It says, hey, you don't want to eat me. I'm nasty. Here are my colors to warn you that I'm nasty. We also have other adaptations outside of coloration, for example, camouflage. The walking stick is a great example of an organism that is highly camouflaged to blend in with the forest floor. This is a remarkable case of selection and adaptation. We also have something else called mimicry. Okay, in this case, when we're talking about the monarch and the viceroy butterfly, this is a case of Batesian mimicry. It's so interesting. The benign viceroy butterfly, this is the mimic. This is a organism that doesn't have toxic chemicals inside of its skin or its parts. Instead, it pretends that it does by modeling after the monarch butterfly. Okay, so the viceroy butterfly is actually palatable. It is benign, but it has evolved to closely resemble the distasteful monarch butterfly. So the monarch butterfly is serving as the model for the viceroy mimic. So moving on from predator-prey relationships, let's talk about symbioses in general. So in contrast to predation and competition, some interactions between organisms can be non-antagonistic. They can even be beneficial. In such relationships, we have two symbiotic partners that are engaged in a symbiosis. So a symbiosis is simply two or more species that are living intimately together. It is not necessarily a positive relationship, as we'll talk about in the coming slides. There are different types. There are three major types of these symbiotic relationships. We have mutualisms, where both parties engaged in that symbiotic relationship have a benefit. We have commensalism or commensal symbioses. This is where one member benefits, but the other one is not apparently harmed or benefited in any way. And then we have parasitism. This is where one partner benefits while the other one is being harmed. This is a type of predation. And it might be interesting to note that viruses are considered to be parasites. So when you're asked what sits at the top of the food chain on planet Earth, it's actually not humans. It is viruses and diseases that attack and have parasitic relationships to humans. We often have within these symbiotic relationships coevolution. For example, a clear example of this is the coevolution between plants and their pollinators. The pollinators have behaviors and the plants have forms and shapes that mutually benefit for each other. For example, many moths are adapted to pollinate particular flowering plants. This relationship is going to enhance the survival of both partners because the moth needs food and the plant needs to spread its seed through the moth pollinator. There's also a specific type of symbiotic relationship in a lichen. So whenever you see a lichen on a rock or growing on bark, you're actually looking at two different organisms engaged in a symbiosis. This is a mutualistic relationship because both partners are benefiting. So in lichen, a fungus and a photosynthetic partner which is either an alga or cyanobacterium, they combine tissues to mutual benefit. And so this is extremely fascinating. It's, you know, one little ecosystem basically in one lichen, where both partners are providing a benefit, where the fungus is providing structure to the lichen, and the photosynthetic partner is providing food. And here's an easy way, an easy table for you to wrap your mind around the different types of symbiotic interactions, and then who is receiving a benefit or not affected or harmed. So here are just quick examples of these different types of symbioses. Here we have a mutualistic. Here we have the symbiosis between the fungus and photosynthetic partner in a lichen. We also have mutualism displayed here by a parasite-eating bird that is eating parasites on a deer that's infested with parasites. So both partners are engaged in behaviors that are benefiting both of them. And then, of course, we have commensalism, where there's an intimate connection between two species, but neither are receiving any clear benefit and neither are being harmed. So an example here is a tropical tree that has sitting on it a bromeliad plant that's growing and living. So in an ecosystem, each species has a role to play. And one of the most foundational roles in a community and an ecosystem is a keystone species. A keystone species is any species in an ecosystem that plays a critical role in the structure of the biological community. Scientists have recently learned that the effect of a keystone species in a community can ripple across many trophic levels. So that means it's not only affecting the thing that's feeding upon it, for example, but the stuff that feeds upon the thing that feeds upon it. So there's a cascading or a ripple effect if you damage or in some way remove keystone species. A clear example of the keystone species in aquatic environments is the starfish. Believe it or not, starfish are keystone species. They play a crucial role in maintaining the biodiversity of a community because they actively feed upon mussels, you know, the little bivalves that look like clams. If you take away these starfish, the mussel populations boom and they take over absolutely everything. And because they become so abundant because there's nothing preying upon them, then it reduces the overall biodiversity of the entire ecosystem. And so in the next lecture, we'll talk a little bit more about community ecology.